Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the 2022 edition of the OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum. My name is Jo Tyndall. I recently joined the OECD as Environment Director, and I'm really excited to be here this afternoon and to hear the discussion on this topic. The forum today and tomorrow is going to focus on how green innovation has been impacted by the double economic shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, the energy and commodity crises triggered by the war in Ukraine. Very, very topical, very pertinent, and we know increasingly that without technology innovation, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve our climate change and environmental goals. So it's my very great pleasure to invite our Secretary General, Matthias Cormann, to formally open our conference this afternoon. So please come to the stage for your opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Jo. A warm welcome to Minister Stuart Nash, Ambassador Michaela Späth, Under-Secretary Peterson, Professor Mazzucato, colleagues, distinguished guests, friends all. A warm welcome to the 2022 edition of the OECD Green Growth and Sustainable Development Forum, which we look at green innovation in the context of economic shocks. You might remember at the time of last year's forum, the green shoots of the recovery had began to emerge in earnest. You may recall how your discussions last year focused on how this recovery could be an opportunity to make the built environment and the transport sector more sustainable. But of course, since then, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has caused a very significant disruption to all of that. It caused not only a humanitarian disaster for the people of Ukraine, but also a massive global economic shock and indeed a major energy crisis, with energy prices having risen sharply across the world, and our efforts to improve energy security and to cushion the impact of higher energy prices now colliding with our green energy transition and climate change mitigation objectives, which remain as urgent and as important as ever. The truth is, and I know that all of us here agree, we must do it all. We must cushion the cost burden of sharp energy price rises on the vulnerable. We must shore up energy security in the short and over the medium and long term, and we must remain on track for carbon neutrality by 2050. This means we must find new ways to increase low emissions energy supplies while finding new ways to reduce energy consumption by increasing energy efficiency, yes, but also through profound technological leaps in energy generation and transportation. We need an extraordinary level of innovation, but it's not an unprecedented level of innovation. The relatively rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines has demonstrated just how capable we are when international scientific cooperation generates a burst of ideas and solutions in the wake of a crisis. We can do it. When the mission is clear and we take a solutions focus, we can find the solutions we need. So let me just touch on three priority areas that we see. We do need to accelerate green innovation and ensure that the goals of energy security, affordability, and emissions reduction are appropriately aligned. Increased diversification of energy sources, faster and more widespread adoption of renewable power and battery technologies, and increased energy efficiency measures can all help to improve energy security while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. To support this, mission-oriented innovation policies hold important promise to increase the effectiveness and the efficiency of our innovation policies. Coordinated policy packages can combine resources and knowledge across policy silos to better the net zero objective. But our ongoing research here at the OECD shows that innovation policies often lack sufficient scale and are often run by science, technology and innovation authorities too much on their own. To have wide-ranging impacts, these policies need to mobilize and align a wider range of actors and resources. Second point, policies need to support research on new technologies like green hydrogen. Around half of the CO2 emissions reductions needed by 2050 will rely on technologies that are not yet commercially available. OECD data shows, however, that patenting activity in green technologies has decreased in recent years, and public research and development expenditures in low-carbon technologies has actually remained flat. In OECD countries, public research and development into low-carbon technologies has averaged at around 0.03 to 0.04% of GDP over the past decade. On the other hand, OECD data does show that around 1/3 of all pandemic recovery-related expenditure across member countries and selected large economies does have and is having a positive impact on the environment. The recovery plans of several countries feature investment in green hydrogen development, for example, in Germany, in France, and in Spain. Scaling up green hydrogen is a key element in the 2050 net zero emissions scenarios of many countries. And the OECD is supporting countries in these efforts by investigating the barriers to green hydrogen deployment and possible policy solutions. For example, by reducing uncertainty through the promotion of international standards, hydrogen infrastructure, and more generally, sound regulatory standards. Our clean energy finance and investment mobilization program is supporting emerging economies to develop their own national hydrogen strategies and supply chains. The third point is that policies and regulatory frameworks need to address the constraints that innovative small companies and startups face for research into and adoption of green technologies. These companies can play a key role in the development of new technologies and business models for the green transition. But often they face barriers in accessing resources for the green transition, such as finance, skills, knowledge, and technology. Public policy needs to enable small and medium-sized enterprises to overcome these size-related barriers. For example, governments can introduce programs and initiatives to increase access to digital and sustainable skills. The OECD is supporting such efforts by developing evidence on the policies at national, subnational and international levels that can enable these firms to thrive in the green transition, including through the OECD Digital for SMEs Global Initiative. In closing these opening remarks, it's exactly at times like this, at the times of crisis, that we must maintain and generate that additional momentum on mitigating and adapting to climate change. Let's not let this crisis go to waste. We cannot wait. We must increase the development and adoption of green technologies, and the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how human ingenuity can be unlocked and innovative responses to crisis can be found when countries and people from around the world commit to the necessary international scientific cooperation. So over the next 2 days, you will share ideas on how to create the right policy framework to jumpstart this cooperation and to accelerate the green transition. And I certainly, on behalf of all of our member countries, wish you well in your very important discussions, and I look forward to some very positive outcomes-focused results. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Secretary General. I think that core message resonates really, really strongly, that when it comes down to it, we can rise to the challenge. We know we can do it, providing we have that sense of urgency and that sense of collective responsibility. So I think that's really set the scene very well for the forum this afternoon and tomorrow. We now have a panel of speakers, followed by a discussion, and we're delighted to have the distinguished speakers here that Matthias drew attention to. But now I'd like to invite our Deputy Secretary General, Kerry-Ann Jones, who is here to moderate the rest of this opening session. So Kerry-Ann, if you and the speakers could come to the stage, I will leave the rest of the afternoon to you.
As was mentioned, I'm Deputy Secretary General, and I'm the lucky Deputy Secretary General to be in charge of OECD's horizontal work, an effort to look across the entire organization and move forward the green growth and sustainable development agenda. As highlighted by the Secretary General, we do need significantly to accelerate the pace of innovation and deployment of the technologies needed for the green transition. The question is, can the double economic shocks of the pandemic and the war-induced energy and commodity crisis be an accelerator for this transition? The mandate of this annual Green Growth Sustainable Development Forum is to bring together several OECD committees to engage in multidisciplinary dialogue and identify knowledge gaps. This can then inform future OECD work, including the next steps on the cross-cutting project I mentioned, which is officially called Building Climate and Economic Resilience. 13 different OECD policy committees are involved in this, and that includes the Committee on Science and Technology Policy, the Committee on Industry, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, the Committee on Small Enterprises and Entrepreneurship, the Environmental Policy Committee, and there are others who I'm not naming, but it really cuts across, which I think we realize is the nature of the problem we face. We have some of the delegates from these committees here today, and the Secretariat actively participating in different sessions throughout today and tomorrow. So without further ado, allow me to introduce to you our distinguished speakers who will help us set the stage for our conference. And they will all give keynote remarks, and then after that we'll have a panel discussion. So first, I'm delighted to introduce our first scene setter, who is Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She is professor in economics of innovation and public value at University College London, and the founding director of UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She is the winner of international prizes, including, and I'll try to pronounce this correctly, Grande Ufficiale Ordine al Merito della Repubblica Italiana. It's my best try. In 2021. That is Italy's highest civilian honor, and she's also the winner of the 2020 John Van Neumann Award, and she's going to join us virtually online. Then we will hear from the speakers on the stage who I would like to introduce to you. We will hear from Mr. Stuart Nash, who is the Minister of Economic and Regional Development, Tourism, Small Business, and Forestry of New Zealand. Minister Nash first entered politics in 2008, and in his career has been Minister of Police, Revenue, Fisheries, and for Small Business, and he has worked in senior management in small and large organizations in both the private and the public sectors. Ms. Michaela Spayeth, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Germany to the OECD. She will also be speaking. Prior to taking up her duties in Paris, Ambassador Spayeth served as Deputy Director General for Energy and Climate Policy, Business and Human Rights, International Labor Rights, and Issues at the German Federal Foreign Office. Ambassador Spayeth played an instrumental role in the setting up of the International Renewable Energy Agency, known as IRENA, at the German Federal Foreign Office in Berlin. Another speaker is Ms. Javiera Peterson, Undersecretary of Economy and Small Business, Ministry of Economy, Development and Tourism of Chile. The Undersecretary has previously worked for the World Bank and the University of Chile. And one of our last speaker will be, we are joined by Jans Lundsgaard, our OECD Deputy Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation, who helps oversee OECD's work on digital and technology policy, productivity, and science and innovation. And not least of all, how this all applies to the transition to a green economy. From 2011 to 2017, he served as Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Business and Growth in Denmark. So first, let me turn the stage over to our guest who is online, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, to give her opening remarks.
There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so let me just do the difficult bits. Here we go. So thank you so much. And I was so happy to also hear the comments by the Secretary General because they are extremely in symbiosis with what I will be speaking about. He talked about urgency, the need for mission-oriented policies, which of course, makes us think of what we do when we actually go to war. No one thinks when you go to war, and of course there is a tragic geopolitical situation right now where we are back at war. But what's interesting when we go to war is no one ever says, oh, just put a bit of money in and hope for the best. We apply mission orientation when we want to win wars. And really the problem is we haven't actually approached our societal challenges around improving and strengthening our health systems, reducing inequality, reducing the digital divide, but especially the need to tackle this climate crisis with that same level of urgency and seriousness in terms of really transforming our government policies from procurement to budgeting to the design of public-private partnerships to actually deliver on the goal. And that's what I'd like to talk about in my opening remarks, which is what does it mean to have a goal orientation where climate-related goals and what I will call moonshots actually drive that public-private partnership which we need. And of course, we seem to just be in constant reactive mode. So I've been advocating for a market shaping mode where we're actually proactively designing the economic system, designing capitalism to tackle the problems, but also not to always be just fixing the market failures along the way. What does it mean to shape and co-create an economy and really using in some ways the opportunities today of these crises to kickstart serious and urgent mission-oriented investment and innovation, but done in, again, a way that we really design the economy to deliver on these goals. And in so doing, actually also deliver economic growth. When we need investment and innovation to tackle a problem, that's the best way actually to kickstart productivity and investment rather than starting with the goals around productivity and investment and jobs and somehow thinking that that's going to happen on its own. Those, in fact, can be true spillovers and multiplier effects from a goal-oriented economy. And, needless to say, this COVID-19 moment, which we're still living through, because of course there's links between climate change and the future pandemics that we will be having, have really highlighted just the lack of preparedness. It's just really striking if you think globally how we weren't able to deliver personal protection equipment to frontline workers. We weren't able to zero the digital divide so students in lockdown could access their human right to education. We didn't have dynamic test and trace systems or the ability to govern our digital platforms around the infodemic. So this really should be a huge wake-up call. And of course, it happened, COVID, on the back of the crisis that you're talking about today. And it's absolutely true what the Fridays for the Future movement continue to remind us, which we are really just blah-blah-blahing. We are not treating this crisis as urgent. If you look even at the COVID-19 recovery funds, so much of them actually went to fossil fuel-driven projects. It could have been an opportunity to shape immediate cash release to those companies that were hurting, but with conditions attached that were about carbon neutrality, reducing the material content of production. And it was not the way that we handled the recovery. And also there's a huge problem around corporate governance. I mean, if we look at just the lack in many ways over the last 50 years of profits being reinvested back into the system to really deliver on the goals that we have. One of the things we should be looking about really is the corporate governance structures. We have over 6 trillion having been used just to buy back shares in the last 10 years to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And the recent energy crisis that we're facing has enabled very large markups in the sector of oil and gas. And it's quite striking how much these profits being generated from those monopoly power structures were then also used to a large extent, again, to buy back shares, to the point that they increased over 2,000% buybacks in oil and gas in the fourth quarter of 2021. Oops, why is this not moving? There we go. And of course, COP27 delivered on some important goals, especially those related to loss and damage, but it's simply not true that it was used to really galvanize that kind of urgency that we just heard the Secretary General call for, which I must say has also been called for very eloquently by the Secretary General of the United Nations. You know, we have recovery programs. We have the IRA program in the United States. We have our own in Europe, Next Gen EU program. In theory, these are also supposed to be really helping us redirect our economies around the ambitious green agenda, the digital agenda, all of this to become also more resilient for the future. But what my message really will be that unless we change how we do capitalism, unless we change how we do government, unless we change how we do business, unless we change how they work together in a different way, then the deep change that we require, the change to actually bring urgency to the system and goal orientation to the system, will not happen. And this requires bringing purpose to the center of corporate governance, but for real. So talking the talk is not enough. We have to walk the talk of stakeholder value. How do we get different organizations in the economy to work together with a common good and a purpose at the center that can actually galvanize that kind of investment towards goal orientation? And in terms of policy design, we need to really move away from this idea that at best what government can do is fix different types of problems along the way, whether that's carbon taxes to fix for negative externalities, whether that's research and development spending for fixing for the positive externalities, whether that's SME financing to fix the asymmetric information problem. Of course, we need all these different tools, but they can't be designed to fail. And they are designed to fail if we just see them as bandages in the system. You don't get transformational change through fixing market failures, unless we just want to fix tiny little incremental things. Transformational change requires market shaping and market co-creation. And we know how to do this. We would have never gone to the moon, ever, had we just been facilitating, enabling, fixing market failures along the way. I've just written a book about this, so you can tell I'm a bit passionate about this point. But the Apollo program was fascinating in the way that they actually designed the collaboration. The first thing they did to get to the moon was change how they were doing procurement. You know, something as simple as procurement policy, they changed it from being cost plus procurement towards a challenge-oriented procurement with incentives for innovation and quality improvement. They also had a no excess profits clause. In other words, this required collective collaboration, collective intelligence, and they didn't want it to become a gambling casino. They also transformed the challenge that was beat the Russians space race into a very concrete mission, which was to get to the moon and back in a short amount of time. And in order to do that, they required lots of different actors. There was 400,000 people involved. There was lots of different sectors involved. It was not just aerospace, in the same way that today climate change, of course, is not just about renewable energy. It's about every single sector transforming itself, but especially collaborating around all the homework problems along the way. And this is why we really need to think through what is a earth-shot way of dealing with the current moonshots that we must have around climate strategy. And I was lucky enough to work with the European Commission on this idea of missions to the point that they actually listened, which is wonderful. Academics, we often write stuff and no one listens. In this case, I was lucky they listened, and now there's a missions instrument in Europe. And what it really means is what I just said. Start with the Sustainable Development Goals. And by the way, climate actually runs across many of those. It's not just SDG 13. Turn them into the moonshots, get lots of different sectors to collaborate together so that industrial strategy is not just a sector-based strategy, a list of sector-based strategy, but it's a goal-oriented strategy that brings multiple sectors together, and then redesigning those tools on the ground that really crowd in and create that multiplier effect through lots of experimentation in the business community, but towards a goal. What we often have in countries is the reverse of this figure. Lots of projects, even with the Next Gen EU, which forced countries to come up with strategies. What they ended up with was lots of projects falling on their heads because we lack that ability to really think in this mission-oriented industrial strategy kind of way. And of course, the mission should be sitting on top of ministries. There's no one ministry that is going to deal with climate, for example. Any sort of climate strategy will change what we eat, how we move, the materials that we use to build. And so this is a really key point, that the missions need that kind of all of government approach, but they also need to help us redesign our policies, redesign the instruments like procurement, redesign our institutions like public banks. So they're providing patient long-term finance to those organizations that are willing to work with you towards a goal. So moving away from a picking winners to a picking the willing kind of mentality, again, of industrial strategy. I wrote a second report for the commission, which was, I'm going fast there. Well, this first report, talked about missions as having to be inspirational and bold, a clear direction, cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, cross-actor, and really driving those bottom-up solutions that we need. It requires new ways also to evaluate our investments. Do they actually create those dynamic spillovers we need across the economy? Or are we putting all our eggs in one basket, which of course then does lead to the problem of picking winners if things don't go well with that particular egg. So that kind of portfolio approach, but also that ability to evaluate dynamically the spillovers along the way, which again, the key success of the moon landing was precisely that. I talked already about this need for procurement. Again, really interesting that we would not have gotten to the moon without that redesign of instruments to be outcomes oriented. But also that no excess profits clause that NASA put in there really addresses also that corporate governance issue. How do we share both the risks and the rewards so the sustainable growth trajectory that we are looking for also leads to a more inclusive growth trajectory instead of a gambling machine. Let me just skip forward and just say that all of this also needs to be experimented with. I'm increasingly working with cities in Valencia, in Barcelona, in Manchester, where we're looking with mayors to really think, what does it also mean for how we design our cities? And what we need is also more learning between the local and the national. Sometimes at the local level, we can experiment more. This is an example of some work we did in Manchester. This is an example of some work we did in Scotland with actually redesigning the public bank, or actually designing a public bank to be mission-oriented. Similarly with the European Investment Bank. What does it mean to have a climate bank? What does it mean for a different way to approach risks, rewards, but also that picking the willing kind of dynamic that we need? So if you are a small company, which we heard by the Secretary General, you get extra support because you're small, but trying to actually innovate and invest towards this climate goal. You don't get money just because you're small or just because you're in a particular sector. In Sweden, what's so interesting is these climate missions have fallen on the really everyday stuff like school meals. School meals in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. This means that something as simple as school lunch becomes a lever for innovation. And in developing countries, of course, where the school lunch is often the only lunch that many kids get, even more so, really transforming this lever to be part of the climate agenda. So the welfare state and the innovation state become one and one. Let me just go forwards here with my last slide. That issue of corporate governance is also an issue of public and private relationships. We need more conditionality, not the old conditions of the past that reduce the fiscal space, of many countries. But the conditionalities that are about investment or about innovation, and what's so striking here, you see the picture of the French finance minister. In some countries during COVID-19, there were conditions attached to the COVID bailouts, like with Renault and Air France. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions. In other countries like the UK, we were very comfortable with giving 600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. This idea of conditionality to build a new social contract is critical. It's really about creating stakeholder value at the center of how we create value, so that pre-distributive result of getting the conditions right from the start are precisely what's going to prevent us from constantly having to pick up the mess afterwards. Thank you so much. Apologies, I went 1 minute over. I hope these remarks were useful to set the scene going.
Thank you very much, Professor Mazzucato. And I'd now like to ask Minister Nash to take the podium for some remarks.
I chair the OECD Digital for SME working group, and I promised officials that I would move away from paper by the time the ministerial came along. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou koutou. As mentioned, my name is Stuart Nash, and I'm the Minister for Economic and Regional Development, Small Business, Tourism and Forestry in the New Zealand Government. First of all, I'd like to thank the OECD for hosting this timely session and for facilitating shared learning globally through experts and events such as these. And today I'd like to discuss two topics. First of all, the role of government in the time of transformation, with emphasis on New Zealand's journey, and second, the role of micro, small and medium enterprises in delivering transformation. Once upon a time, a country's economic direction was by and large determined by markets and external financial forces. And if not outside a politician's theoretical control, governments were certainly viewed as unwelcome interlopers, unless, of course, things went wrong, and then we were expected to come in and pick up the proverbial pieces. But now things must change. If sustainable and meaningful economic progress is to be made in a way that optimises the well-being for all of our diverse communities. New Zealand Government believes that one of our core functions is to help shape the economic environment from one where the market dictates returns and conditions of engagement to one of strategic partnerships and productive alliances. Since the 1980s, in many ways, successive New Zealand governments have led the global charge on deregulation and central bank autonomy, with a singular focus on controlling inflation. Open markets, a rule-based multilateral trading system, and a framework for industry and innovation policies that is based on a market failure analysis characterised our approach over the last 30 years. The prime objective had been economic growth and firm productivity measured by increases in GDP and returns to shareholders. However, adhering to the Washington Consensus framework and philosophy simply doesn't fit into a well-being framework, nor does it put communities at the heart of success determinants. So in 2017, when we came to power, under Jacinda Ardern's leadership, we decided that we needed to radically shift from an emissions-intensive and extraction growth model dominated by Friedmanite shareholder value and maximising profits framework to a green, more resilient and sustainable model that put people at the centre of all policies through a much more hands-on partnership investment approach where jobs and economic security are valued. This model is underpinned by an emission reduction strategy and circular production systems where natural environments are valued for their inherent benefits rather than being seen as purely an economic resource to be exploited for short-term gain. History has shown time again that if left to itself, the market will implement strategies that benefit shareholders at the expense of community stakeholders, and often at the expense of the environment. But while we recognise that economic growth is still incredibly important, so is the quality and sustainability of that growth. And in an environmental, social and governance environment, we must get the governance right at all levels if we are to optimise our environmental and social objectives. So in New Zealand, we are unashamedly implementing a new type of economic plan that seeks to reshape the environment to one where it makes commercial sense for businesses to decarbonise, to eliminate harms, to invest in people, and to have regard to social and environmental outcomes as well as profit. It is part of a brand proposition around volume to values, in that we recognise global consumers will increasingly seek out products that align with their own values. New Zealand's economic vision is of a high-wage, low-carbon economy that provides economic security in good times and bad. The plan is structured around 5 key areas: unleashing business potential, strengthening international connections, increasing capabilities and opportunities, supporting the aspirations of New Zealand's Māori and Pacifica communities, and strengthening our foundations. A core part is to reform existing institutions and establish new ones that embody the values and goals of sustainability, innovation, transformation, and well-being. To this end, we've established a well-being framework for the development of government budgets, the first country in the world to do so. Budget allocations must be assessed against well-being measures such as resilience, sustainability and inclusion, as well as productivity. And the aims of our wellbeing framework broadly align with those of the G7's Cornwall Consensus, which I mentioned briefly earlier. In terms of the roles of SMEs, just like the Cornwall Consensus, a core principle is that of partnership, the ideal of co-creation between business and government, between central government and the regions, and between the government and Māori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand. One that values the mental health and well-being of SME owners and operators, as well as their business aspirations and ambitions. New Zealand is a country of small and medium enterprises. Over 50% of New Zealanders work for businesses that employ less than 100 people. As well as our economy, SME owners are also at the heart of local communities. They are the people who coach our kids' sports teams, the lifeblood of our community organisations, and those who turn up when our communities need a hand. But the scale of change required to implement our government's vision over the next 30 years is huge. However, with support and the right incentives, we want to ensure that SMEs are empowered to innovate and create wealth in a way in which everyone benefits, from those who take risks of business ownership to communities and, of course, future generations. Humane entrepreneurship is a term that I've heard recently that I think embodies a lot of what we're trying to achieve. For example, support is needed to maximise the benefits of digital technologies. To this end, we've implemented a digital boost program set up to fulfil our vision of New Zealand becoming the most digitally enabled small business sector in the world. In line with our wellbeing objectives, support is needed for mental health. And to address this, we've implemented a First Steps mental health program. This program provides SME owners and operators with access to a broad range of help with mental health issues. It is in recognition of the many stresses SME owners face imposed by the pandemic and by the pace of change. And support is needed to build community capacity, resilience, innovation and productivity. In the last 5 years, the government has invested a significant amount of money in our regions. Over $4 billion invested in infrastructure and community projects, but we've also taken equity stakes in private companies on commercial terms and provided concessionary loans to regional startups and SMEs. And thank you to Mariana for inadvertently empowering the strategy through her writings. She's one of my heroes. You know you're getting old when your heroes are younger than you are, right? Just to close, I'd like to say again that the project of transforming our linear and extractive economy to a low emissions, high wage and sustainable economy of the future will only succeed through harnessing the creative and innovative potential of businesses in partnership with a shared vision of what success looks like: values-driven, purpose-led and mission-oriented. You can call it tilting the playing field, you can call it market shaping, or you can call it co-creating. But we believe the government now has a mandate to work in partnership with businesses and communities to create an economic environment consistent with this goal. And I do believe it's whether governments choose to exercise this mandate or not that will ultimately determine the well-being of our diverse communities. And it's important to remember, as Mariana points out in her book, Mission Economy, that in many, many cases, early-stage public investment and support has historically played a significant role in driving innovation and shaping industry development and transformation over the ages. Kia ora, and thank you.
Thank you, Minister Nash. I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Ambassador Smith.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I'm standing in because my Secretary of State, Jennifer Morgan, was still kept in Sharm el-Sheikh, but we will show her on the 25th in the afternoon. So I'm doing a little bit of publicity here with the Friends of Climate. But as I have been the climate ambassador and I have dealt with the issue of energy security and so on, I have been asked to speak, so I'm trying to speak. Much has been said on the question of green transition and energy security at a crossroads. The COVID-19 pandemic and the recent Russian attack on Ukraine has created a double shock. And the crises are manifold. We have the climate crisis, we have the energy crisis, we have the food crisis, and inflation and a debt crisis. But these crises also create opportunities, an opening for substantial green transformation. And I, as our first speaker has of course said, I would have also had hoped that much more money was put into the green building up, but we also have to deal with realities. The war in Ukraine has accelerated the energy transition in my country and Europe. We have learned our lesson. It was a mistake to become dependent on one country and not to have phased out fossil fuels earlier, which we could have done latest when Crimea came about, or when Germany decided to go out of nuclear. My little unity wrote a paper that green energy had also a security element, but at that time nobody wanted to hear that it also meant political independence. That is what we talked about in another discussion today. This is the big problem and you will tackle this here. This is that we have silos and we have really to get and come across the silos. And I hope that OECD is one of the areas where we really learn to work across the silos. We have seen that the fossil fuel dependency is not only detrimental for the climate, it also diminishes our economic sovereignty, our political leeway. It was thus high time that we rethinking energy and climate security together, the criteria by which we define it and the tools we have to hand in hand to enhance it. Energy security means zero carbon, renewable energy, affordable energy, accessible energy in Germany, in Europe, but also beyond Europe, in the whole world. This is why COP27 Germany has been pushing for an ambitious mitigation work program and for more solidarity with the most vulnerable countries. As you are aware, at least regarding the latter, this year the COP delivered by agreeing on a future loss and damage fund. Germany also delivers concrete climate action on the ground, seeking to accelerate global energy transition. The GETP, Just Energy Transition Partnership with India, is one example for the many flagship initiatives we have presented since the beginning of the COP. There is no sugarcoating to it. Climate policy is the geopolitical challenge of our time, as the climate crisis is a tremendous security threat. Right now, we are already living in a 1.1 Celsius world. Manifold geopolitical implications of the climate crisis, such as resource conflicts over water, land, food, and energy, are triggering humanitarian crisis, migration, inequality, and violence. And as we are heading at the moment, unfortunately, still towards a 2.7 Celsius world by the end of this century, things will get worse. The cost of the climate crisis will rise, our leeway to manage it will diminish. The only rational choice to make is to collaborate on all levels, local, national, regional, globally, to bend the curve to keep 1.5 degrees within reach. Driving to an inclusive and fair net zero economy must be a collective goal. But let me be clear, the drive to the zero carbon economy will bring its own geopolitical implications. It will shift the international balance of power. it will change the parameters that define political and economic influences. There will be winners and losers of this transformation. There is the risk of new dependency. New alliances, trade and investment patterns will emerge. This implies new conflicts. It creates new opportunities. And we have seen this, that the fossil fuel producing countries have to be aware of the problem of what was once called the Dutch disease, the rich of stranded assets, and to change. However, some of the middle fossil fuel producing countries are grabbing this opportunity and are thinking, and I think this is a major issue here, also the opportunity of hydrogen, but is hydrogen really the new solution? We will have to see this. The transformation, the transformative energy policy underway is an opening that we cannot afford to miss, and we have to do it right this time. This also means that we have to choose our partners wisely, because we know that prosperity and security are most stable where they go hand in hand with human rights. That is why at the COP27 we organized side events like climate and human rights. To support the most vulnerable countries affected by climate change, the COP finally agreed on the necessary loss and damages fund, a key deliverable this year. This is why the negotiations we have also pushed for the Global Shield Initiative, an important contribution of the most vulnerable countries, and the G7 to take action now. Let me go, I'm running out of time. With regard to the main topics of this forum, research and innovation are the main levers of a successful energy and sustainability transformation, because new ideas and future-oriented solutions are crucial in all fields of energy transition and sustainable development. We therefore fund research for sustainable development with our Research for Sustainability Strategy, short FONA strategy, that is funded with 4 billion euros and focus on 3 strategic goals to which research can make a decisive contribution. First, achieving the climate goals. Second, research, protect and use habitats and natural resources. 3, good living conditions throughout the country by developing society and economy. Likewise, tomorrow's energy supply must be safe, clean and dependable. Green hydrogen is our chance. We want to rely fully on renewable energies. It helps us to drive the transformation towards sustainability and climate neutrality, and to free ourselves from one-sided dependencies, thus securing our prosperity in the long term. That means working towards a hydrogen economy. Research not only removes hurdles, but it also opens doors. Research is a key driver for ramping up the hydrogen economy. It's the key for the overall goal, a fair, inclusive and net zero economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I now would like to invite Undersecretary Javiera Peterson to the podium to give her remarks.
Hola a todas y todos. I want to begin by saying thanks to Secretary General and the other distinguished participants of this forum for joining today to discuss green innovation policies and the impact of economic shocks. As we know, the climate crisis and the goal of achieving environmental sustainability constitute one of the main challenges to be met in development policies to date. This is particularly important in the Global South, where poverty and inequalities are still the core social demands, and the climate crisis is felt first and worst. Climate change is a global but very heterogeneous phenomenon that entails inequalities. Policymakers in the Global South must balance the emergency and short-term demands with the pressure to advance in more long-term policies and goals, a policy challenge that the pandemic and the war-induced energy and commodity crisis added to European countries. As we are all aware, the central dilemma in the balance between growth and environmental sustainability is that the process of industrialization followed by developed countries to move forward high productivity activities and higher incomes appears to be against the efforts to face climate emergency. From our point of view, this false dichotomy between choosing growth or environmental sustainability rests in how the link between wealth creation and structural change is understood. A systematic comprehension of how the process of production transformation towards high productivity activities and achieving environmental sustainability interact in different countries, especially in the Global South, is essential to understanding not only how a green economy would look like, but also how to transition to a green economy. By emphasizing the transition, the departing economic structure, and not just the end goal, gains a greater significance in the policy design, especially for innovation policies. Targeting green sectors from advanced and non-advanced economic structure is different not only because of the technological content of the green product and services opportunities, but also because of the different scopes and sources of improvements that industries have in developed, non-developed countries, and also giant latecomers and China or India. This is why policies aiming green innovation are so important for sustaining a green transition in Chile and other Latin American countries. And to do so, we must apply industrial and technological policies to absorb technology and build endogenous productive and technological capabilities, diversify our productive structure, change our pattern of specialization, and thus overcome external restriction by diversifying export towards products increasingly intensive in knowledge. These capabilities must come both from the diffusion of existing technologies and from powerful innovation policies, recognizing that Chile and all developing countries need domestic industrial capabilities to achieve a just and a green transition without a total dependence on foreign technologies. To build the domestic productive and technological capabilities required to conduct a sustainable structural change, we need to design public policies capable of fully understanding the complex intertemporal relationship between production transformation and environmental sustainability. This approach will be included in the Green Taxes chapter of the tax reform proposed by our government. The main goal of our tax reform proposal is to increase government revenues to finance structural reforms in a fiscally responsible manner. Regarding environmental goals, the tax system is an essential tool for achieving a fast and a just transition, not only because of the revenues from the environmental taxes, but also because green taxes can be designed to impulse a technical and productive transformation in our countries. Even though carbon pricing measures are key components of any environmental tax system, we think that it's equally important that the design of green taxes ensure the development of local productive capabilities and do not sharpen the industrialization paths merely by replacing local with foreign emissions. A second example of the challenge we must overcome is funding. How to finance the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. We're currently working on an institutional framework that allows the creation of financial instruments with a real mandate to finance the green innovation. In Chile, we have different development institutions, but we lack a systematic and coordinated approach at national level. For that reason, the goal of our government is to have a national system of financial instruments coordinated and with a clear mandate to finance the transition towards a green, sustainable, and decentralized productive transformation through an effective financing strategy that can channel public and private investment toward projects with greater environmental and social benefits. In this context, one of the main challenges is how to incorporate a clear green mandate and coordination mechanism with other public institutions, but with flexibility to adapt to new demands. Consequences of climate emergency are ever evolving, and institutions need to be able to adapt to this. That is why boosting trust in public policies is also critical. To finish, I would like to underline the fact that what is green, what is sustainable, will always be a political definition that need social consensus, and therefore, reinforced democracy is a necessary condition to be included in any policy at every country to really overcome efficiently the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. I would like to ask now Jens Lundsgaard to come to the podium to talk a little bit about OECD's latest findings about green innovation.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne. I choose to be an optimist, at least a little bit, because remember those days when people didn't really believe that it was all man-made. I mean, after all, science won. In the end, science won. We understood we have to listen to science to understand climate. What we need to do now is to go much faster at using science to find the solutions to get us into the transition to net zero. For us at the OECD Science, Technology and Innovation Directorate, I can promise you that is an agenda that we will be engaging much more in the coming years than we have in the past. What does the world need? Basically two things. We need breakthrough technologies, but we also need to act fast. And that sort of contrast is in a way mind-boggling, and it will go through a bit as a theme in what I'll be saying here, taking us towards what should we do. Well, of course, we do require human and financial resources in R&D, and we need to find new ways to collaborate around mission-oriented policies, as was also said by our professor. And we need to link science, innovation, and industrial transformation. Let's go a bit into that based on recent OECD work. As Corman said, public R&D expenditures for low-carbon technologies have remained depressingly flat for decades. This needs to change. The good news is that the green recovery programs have helped. Governments allocated around $150 billion to early-stage low-emission technologies as part of the recovery packages. Next step will be to keep this in place, to keep this level of funding sustained over the longer term so that it can fully interact with the market pull that comes from carbon pricing and similar instruments. That takes me to my second example of recent OECD work, comparing how do countries then in practice use mission-oriented approaches to this challenge. National hydrogen strategies is one example where our colleagues have been examining how they've been put in place in different countries, and I can tell you that New Zealand, Germany and Chile all come out well. Well done, congratulations. Actually so well that we are saying, hang on, let's do this more generally. I mean, energy sector, that's one thing. It's a first challenge when it comes to climate, but there'll be a need for a much, much wider transformation of the private sector. And this form of approach, sitting down to say, what is needed in this particular sector, mission-oriented, to take us to the net zero transition, can actually be pretty good. Take something like steel. A good old sector, you might say, that may not be known for being super environmentally friendly. Well, that's a challenge. What is it about? It's about, of course, putting research and innovation funding into it, but it's also about identifying regulatory issues. We spoke of green hydrogen strategies. Now, when someone in your country has made green hydrogen, they should ideally trade it internationally. And we don't want that to be any kind of greenwashing. So regulatory issues like low carbon hydrogen certification will be important. Another nice example, at OECD we have something called the Steel Committee. We also have the Shipbuilding Committee. And mind you, you cannot sail on hydrogen. You need to transform it to something else. In practice, it would be ammonia. Now, ammonia is, as humorous people say, it's a slightly poisonous gas that's normally used to harass people. So if we're going to do this transformation, mind you, there's also going to be people who are building ships who are going to look at how would they look in the future. And that side of the industrial transformation, I think, is actually the link that we also need to add, and which from STI's directorate side, we'll be very keen to collaborate on acting. So we have research, science, we have innovation, but how do we also get things going quickly on that very basic level of building ships that can actually sail on climate neutral fuels? There we are. Let me wrap up by challenging a classic dictum made by economists, which goes that we have basic research that government should finance that happens in universities, and then you have industry. We give them a tax credit for the research they do. Now, this kind of model where things are at quite some distance from each other is not good if we want to go fast. So we come back to this issue that we want to have breakthrough technologies, but we also need to act fast. And I would say, the most fascinating I have seen has been to go out on the ground in very real-life living labs. In Denmark, where I come from, we have something called Green Lab Denmark. And there, when you meet people, those you meet are small entrepreneurs who do things in food, for example, and you ask them, whom do you collaborate with? And they tell you, well, I'm in touch with the most cutting-edge biochemistry professors. And by the way, then I have these people wearing a good blue-collar suit that goes around optimizing the industrial process of this biotech process. That kind of combining cutting-edge university research and the things that are needed to get the cost down, get it to work in practice, cut out all the old technologies that are polluting, cut them out by simply providing better initiatives. That's where I hope we can be helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers, and I think you can see they have laid out the green challenge for innovation that we're facing from many different perspectives. So what we'd like to do now is sort of turn into more of a panel discussion. But first, I would have a question for Professor Mazzucato. I don't know if she's still online. Are you still? Oh, great, you're still here. I have a question for you because I know you have some time constraints. So I'll ask the professor a question first and then turn to the panel. So Professor, the introduction of ambitious green policies has often been held back because of the concern about negative social impacts that are possible on certain workers or certain communities. But in your work, you really argue for the introduction of policies to prevent inequality rather than simply mitigating it. So can you talk a little bit about this pre-distribution approach, how you can boost support for accelerating green innovation, but also addressing what could be considered negative social impacts?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. And also thanks for all the other speakers. All your comments and reflections were incredibly useful and insightful. So the pre-distribution lens means how do we actually shape the relationships between the different actors in our economic system to get the relationships right from the start, so we don't have to pick up the mess afterwards. So how do we innovate around the common good, for example? Think of the situation with the vaccines during COVID. The vaccine wasn't the mission. Vaccinating the entire world was the mission. Then we should backtrack and ask, what does that mean for intellectual property rights? What does it mean for the conditionality? For example, when Oxford University set conditions with AstraZeneca, very different, by the way, from the Pfizer model, which was, I would argue, a bit more extractive. With AstraZeneca, the prices and the costs were negotiated to remain low precisely so they could be more easily accessible. The knowledge sharing, which the World Health Organization has been calling for during the global pandemic, was adhered to. We're working with the CHIPS Act in the United States with Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo, thinking there as well. When we have these funds coming into the system, which is a good thing. We need investment by both public and private. How do we embed within something like the CHIPS Act conditionality on the prevention, for example, of the use of these funds just to buy back shares? How can we use green procurement? How can we make sure that the companies benefiting from such funds, or also if you think of the healthcare funds that are driving a lot of the drug innovation, How can we make sure that that's conditional on the companies involved improving working conditions, reinvesting profits into R&D, again, using green procurement. So all this kind of conditionality shouldn't be seen as a stick. In fact, I don't like the word conditionality. It should really be seen as a new social contract, a new way of working together with that kind of collective value creation at the center, but the idea that a partnership in and of itself is not a normative thing. It's not necessarily good. It depends how you design that partnership. And this is why I do think the concept of stakeholder value should really be held to account, what it means for the interrelationships between different actors. And, you know, one of the things we know about inequality is that it has also risen during periods where even, you know, productivity was increasing, but wages weren't increasing alongside productivity. That's not right, but the way to fix that is actually to make sure that workers' voices are also at the table in that stakeholder value kind of way of doing things, which we know that, for example, in Scandinavia, many very competitive companies have trade unions on the board. Similarly, in Germany, this doesn't hurt innovation. What matters is how these different parties at the table in the boardroom, but also outside of the boardroom, can really be thinking about the mission co-creation together. And I really appreciated the words of from New Zealand. We've actually been talking quite a bit to the New Zealand government about this approach of putting well-being at the center, not only of the macroeconomy, but what does it mean for the kind of meso and microeconomy? What's the link between corporate governance at the micro level, at the meso level, how we design institutions? I gave some examples, for example, public banks. And then at the macro level, having that dashboard, which New Zealand has been so brilliant with, where we know that if it's just one number on your car, you're going to crash the car. Well, similarly, we're crashing our economies just by looking at GDP without having that dashboard of different types of metrics, but combining the kind of, you know, mission orientation around the meso, how to get different sectors working together around goals, and the macro economy with the dashboard of what those goals are, starting with the SDGs. I think this is really the challenge.
Thank you for that. I have a quick follow-up question, just because a key word I think we've all heard today is urgency. And Professor, given trying to work out these conditions ahead of time, looking at a new social contract in a period of urgency, can that all be done? How does the policy move urgently as well as the innovation? Because I think that's one of the challenges we face. Do you have a minute to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different points. One is you don't want to be micromanaging. So the conditions are really about putting very bold conditions, which then how you do it is up to you, right? So in Germany, when the KfW created a loan for the steel industry, which was conditional on the steel sector lowering its material content, they didn't tell the steel sector how to do that. That was conditioned. They then did it by introducing repurpose, reuse, recycle technology across the whole supply chain, to the point that today both Germany and Sweden have a very green steel production, not because they went to Davos to talk about purpose, but because they had to get that loan. So setting a direction and conditions without the micromanaging is key. And the second point about urgency is, you know, there's always contracts anyway. It's not like, you know, currently when things are done quickly, there's no contracts. We just have become very lazy with those contracts. And I think the idea of lazy partnerships, marriages fall apart when you have nothing to talk about at the dinner table, or when one has so much power over the other. So how do we actually increase the confidence in the room and get the right deal, given that we also talk about deals, the New Deal, the Green Deal? I think we've talked a lot about the green bit, not enough. COP27 should have done more, but the deal really requires a different type of attention to the design of these contracts. And the contracts exist. We just have to make them the right contracts.
Thank you very much for that. And I know you do have to leave us, but thank you very much for your participation and your comments. We really appreciate it. So now let me turn to the panel, and I have several questions, but I have one to start with for all of you, and it relates to this moment in time, which I think you heard the Secretary General refer to, and that is that with the COVID pandemic and the energy crisis, how do you think that is influencing the debate around green science and innovation? And a more kind of current question is, now that we have the last COP behind us, have priorities changed now that we have the outcome of this most recent, meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh? So, who would like to go first? Volunteers? Okay. Ambassador?
Is this on?
Yes,
Yeah.
you're on.
Yeah. I don't think priorities have really changed. If anything, it has become more urgent, or the need for green science and innovation is now more important than ever. The current crisis demonstrates that the need for green transition and the need for innovation, it's without alternative. I think we have to really see how innovative technologies and patents are a key factor also, and there comes the foreign policy person, of course, in me. It is also a geopolitical issue, how to do this, and where's the technological leadership. And this year's COP has shown that we have still a long way ahead of us, and we will have to see. But I think what is the other big issue, and we also talked about this today, we were already on a panel together, you see, is how to get the private sector to invest in this. I mean, it's not only public money, and maybe you do it by benchmarking like the KfW did for Krups and others, to go into this, but this is the big issue. And this is also the big issue to get investment, because my father was an engineer, they always have good ideas, and they have piles of ideas in their drawers, and they have solutions, but it has to be applicable. And we know by the paper by Fatih Birol, I'm saying International Energy Agency, 1.5 years ago, how much innovation still has to be done, and how much we are calculating the aim of 2050 being net zero is already based on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Others? Jans?
Thank you. Well, in a way, we used to have discussions about how can we put a price on carbon, and how can you do a tax, trading system, or this and that. And somehow the wonderful thing in the horror of the crisis we're living in now is that that price is definitely there. And what we then see is often that many countries, people, businesses scramble a bit to how to react to the high gas prices that we see in many countries. Well, what should we do? Well, let me think of Poland. I would suggest to sit down tomorrow and say, what do? We're a country with a lot of agricultural waste and household waste. Could we make biogas of that? What's the sort of, what would it take to develop that? What are the sort of researchers we already have in different technical universities in Poland? What are the sort of practical implications? And really sort of, benefit from that push we've really got from the high prices now.
Thank you. Minister?
I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way. Mariana talked about a social contract, which I completely buy into that concept, but a contract implies obligations on both sides. If we're to achieve even a little bit of what we've set out to achieve, then we have to tell an incredibly powerful story to many, many people around the value proposition of changing. And I don't think we've done that particularly successfully, if I'm honest with you. There are a number of very powerful players who have attended a number of COPs, and they've sat down and they've talk. They've come out with lofty ambitions, but very, very rarely have those ambitions been realised. And I think the reason for that is because we haven't gone out to our businesses, to our populations, to our communities, to our farmers, and said, you know what, if we don't get this right, then these are the implications for our children and our grandchildren and future generations. It's a very, very difficult story to tell, because it requires change on behalf of everyone, and sometimes that change is expensive and it's costly, and people aren't too sure the implications of that change. The second thing with regard to COVID, certainly in our country, it allowed people just to stop for a brief moment and take a look at what is important to them, to our country going forward. And, government spent a significant amount of money keeping businesses afloat, keeping people engaged in work, but also looking at what a new future might bring in a post-COVID world. So I think there are a number of countries who have taken stock, and politicians have entered into a new form of dialogue with key communities around how we can work together to ensure that the future is different from the past we've just left behind. But that is still an ongoing discussion, and there are still many more important but difficult discussions to have if we're to achieve what we need to achieve.
Thank you. Yeah, I think getting the messages out so people are motivated, we don't realize how much more we have to do on that. Undersecretary.
Yes, thank you. I just want to add just a brief comment because I think that priorities haven't changed, of course, but I could say that maybe how the world is facing these old priorities have changed a little bit. And I just want to highlight one of the results of the last COP27 that was already mentioned, actually, related to the creation of this special fund for loss and damage. It's for the first time in history, actually, that countries grouped at the World Climate Summit agreed on a fund dedicated to pay for losses and damages caused by extreme weather in vulnerable regions in the world. And I would say that the creation of this type of fund and this type of policies has been discussed for years and is often faced a lot of resistance from actually the global north, but also a lot of resistance in groups in the global south, is something that I would say that is a good change in the mission-oriented policies that should be included in this type of discussion, and is something that is certainly a good news that we should be including this type of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the steps to move towards that fund is a big step, a change, but it's been out there under discussion for quite a while. So let me move to another collection of questions, which I will ask to the ambassador and the undersecretary, and to Mr. Jans, if I may. And then I have a particular question for the minister, which gets to his portfolio. So the question for the three panelists are, there's often a mismatch, and this is a very common issue, between the long-term investment needed to support basic research and the shorter cycle of elections. And so we often see that, and the best laid plans can be changed very quickly, and I know I have experienced that in my own career. We've seen recovery plans focused mostly on deployment of existing technologies rather than long-term investments. How can governments really begin to balance this? The short-term need to accelerate adoption of already scalable technologies with the long-term necessity of investment in basic research to get some innovation and technological breakthroughs. I think this is a common challenge we see everywhere. So, panelists, who would like to go first? It's an easy question, right?
You're all looking at me. Well, I think it's a tricky question. I mean, and it's sort of a super interesting question because traditionally, yes, this would be very problematic. But I guess now we are getting to look into something where politically climate is pretty interesting in many countries. And it may well be that we are getting to this area where indeed it is possible. I mean, if we focus on it, to get support for sustaining long-term support for research that's needed for finding the solutions for the transition to net zero. My argument then would be that that's just one thing. It's equally important that we crack the nut of using that basic research quickly. And I think that's where these mission-oriented policies are so interesting, because they create a way of talking together of researchers, of industry, of regulators, and many different people coming together around something that's a worthy purpose. You could nearly say we're looking here at a kind of new form of better capitalism. So if you forgive me, I am a bit optimistic, but I am optimistic only because we are starting to have this discussion about what is the mission. Because I think we're actually getting there, that there's pretty wide support for tackling that mission. If we can put our minds to it, if we can convince everybody, if we can find a role, I guess, also for those who otherwise lose their job. The blue-collar side of innovation is super important, I would say. That's my chip.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Yeah, I would say one of the strengths of Germany has always been that, first of all, we have a well-trained labor force where, and the blue-collar research is one of the backbones of our industry, be it small and medium-size. The so famous hidden champions in Germany, which corner the market on certain issues. But I think also that we have always provided money via the federal government for basic research, not only to industry, but also to, not only to the universities, but also to industry. And I think everybody agrees that green is, in a sense, green has become the flavor of the year, the month, what you have to write into a project, that it's funded. I am sometimes a bit concerned, but that's my personal, not my ambassadorial opinion, that we're putting too many eggs in one basket by only focusing on hydrogen and green hydrogen for energy. I think we should also look in other things. We should also look into other batteries, that we're only looking at one type of ionium batteries. I already spoke about the dependency on certain materials. We have to look whether we're not creating new dependencies on certain issues. So we have to be very careful that we not, but it is long-term research. And when I left, before I became ambassador, I was part of the group which went into the humongous hydrogen project, which has been set up by the German government. Really a big investment where we really got all of Team Germany around the table, because we know it is a big investment. But we have to be careful to find the right areas, that biodiversity is not forgotten, that artificial intelligence and others are there, and we have to look into this, and it's a wild field. Thank you, but I have to say, I'm sorry, I got a phone call. I have to go to the Secretary General, you know. Sorry.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your remarks and for participating. We appreciate it. Would you like to comment?
Yes. I was just thinking about a political economy issue, like that is always around this policy mix that we need to implement in different countries. And I could say that a green transition and a just transition, and more importantly, a fast transition, needs institutional mechanism to foster dialogue and to build this political consensus around reform. This is a very important condition to include in the design of any policy and any institution that we want to actually put forward that can ensure also a strategic view in the policy making. I could say that we all agree that a transparent governance can improve, of course, social cohesion and increase the prospect for building wider social and political consensus for this sustainability. But I want to reinforce maybe something that I already said, that what is green, what is sustainable, it is a political issue. We need to agree in some kind of definition that could put everyone in this room into a same concept, and that is something that is going to be changing. It's not something that is going to be static. So democratic values and also reinforcing democratic institutions is a very important component for any agenda that could really include some policies that can efficiently go ahead in facing the climate crisis. So just, I would say that a good policy mix could involve, for instance, green projects taking part in early participation with the people who live actually in the communities around the projects that is going to be affecting actually the territory. And also to promote local productive activities that add value to industry in which countries have comparative advantages. Is extremely important to sustain and to develop these productive and technological capabilities that are required to actually sustain a structural change that could be just, that could be fast for the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the governance piece comes back, whether it's communication or transparent institutions or mechanisms. And then for our final question, I would turn to you, Minister Nash, to touch on something you commented a bit about in your remarks, and that is small and medium enterprises. We know we really can't have a net zero transition without them participating, and we also know they have a sizable environmental footprint and that they're key to the diffusion of innovation. So they're integral here. So how can we have policy support for the development of skills required for greater small SME innovation and for more widespread adoption of green technology for those at a sustainable price as well?
Sure, it's a very good question, and it's a question that we're debating in the government at this point in time. we did a big study recently and found that 45% of small businesses understood what they needed to do and understood the value proposition around decarbonising and moving to a green future. And that's fantastic, but 55% of businesses didn't. And so there are a number of things we're putting in place, digitisation, for example. There are a number of policies that have an impact on small business, though. So when I talk about telling a really good story, we need to do it in a way that small businesses understand the value proposition of change, because a number of small businesses are owned and operated by those for whom their business isn't that profitable at this point in time. They've struggled to come out to survive the COVID pandemic. They're looking at an uncertain economic future because of what's playing out around the world. And then to say to them, now you must go green, and keeping in mind we have a Prime Minister and a leader who has gone very hard on this and embodies everything that's great around what we're trying to do. She's called it actually our nuclear-free moment. So there is a very, very strong emphasis in our government on this. But it really does come down to very effective communication of that value proposition for small businesses. And the last thing I would say is at this point in time, if a small business has maybe a proactive policy or strategy around mitigating their emissions, they may have some form of competitive advantage, I'm not too sure, but in 5 years' time, if a small business does not have a strategy around carbon mitigation, then I think they will be at a very distinct disadvantage, because I think that more and more customers and consumers are seeking out products and services that align with their values. And as the value proposition around this increases, for the first time in a generation, we've got young people marching in the street around climate change. I mean, that doesn't happen in New Zealand, but it is now. And so businesses would do well to understand where markets are leading, where the consumers are leading, what the consumers want, and come on board with that. But we are there to help them do that. But it's the old, you can lead a horse to water. Right. You can't necessarily make them drink.
Well, thank you for that, and I would like to thank our panel. And I think, just to sum up, if that's even possible, is to sort of touch on some of the words I've heard a lot. Certainly, communication is key in lots of different directions and ways across different kinds of research, different sectors, different communities, different sized businesses, governments. And another one is certainly the value proposition, to convince people of change and to move things along so there's a clear understanding of what's at stake here, what it will cost short-term and long-term. Also governance, I think, and democracy and transparency. I think that's important when we talk about innovation, because sometimes that's something that gets overlooked. And then, of course, as Jans has said quite a bit, optimism. I think we need to keep our optimism and our energy and commitment up to this. And so with that, I would like to ask you to thank our panelists for starting this meeting off with lots of animation and ideas, and send you off for the next couple of days to just move forward on this important topic. So thank you very much.